Darius, all the terrible military websites are what motivated you to do this program. You are not the first student to express that, and that is very true. I think if someone could get the military to give them the contract, there would be a lot of improvement that could probably be done to all sorts of websites. On that note, actually, not to do too much of a digression, but something that occurred to me, especially during Nicole's talk yesterday, is that like everyone here, like we're all already in a pretty specialized world. Just to kind of get into code Platoon, you have to want to, and you have to put in the time to go through and complete the application process and do well enough. And then in your first job in tech, that just continues to happen. And especially as your career moves into a place where most of the other people you work with are also software engineers, it's very easy to lose track of the fact that this is actually already pretty highly specialized knowledge. Like if you go out and talk to like a family member or a buddy who's not a programmer, and you start talking about the document object model and trees, they're gonna look at you and be like, what on earth is all this? That's amazing. Among other programmers, you start talking about the document object model and trees, and everyone just nods their heads because that's our specialty. So it is, I think, really useful to not lose fact of the site that we actually all already know a pretty large amount of highly specialized and pretty valuable knowledge. And so circling back to the military websites, like once you folks start getting out into the working world and working with businesses and companies, you'll see just how valuable these skill sets are and how much it's needed. So with that as a bit of a segue, let's talk a bit about events. And to do that, let me talk a little bit about what an event is, like the idea of an event, which is really simple, and then we'll talk about how the document object model uses events. Because events are not unique to the DOM. An event system is common or classic.
Adam, are you wanting to share your screen?
Oh yeah, that might help. Thank you so much, Kenneth.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. That would help a lot. I'm really glad you said that because I would have just kept going. I had no idea. Thank you.
No problem.
Definitely a teaching moment there. So I hadn't done too much, thankfully. I just created a file named events.js, and I was just going to run it on the command line. And just to point out again, like if we wanted to, we could use a script tag. I can import that or not. I can have my browser request that JavaScript file events.js, because in our HTML file, we're telling it, hey, browser, go find this resource for me. And this is from events.js. I'm just going to use this though to run JavaScript, not in the browser, but from our command line with Node. And Node.js, by the way, uses the same JavaScript engine that Chrome does. It's called V8, like a V8 engine. And they've bundled it up with a bunch of other stuff so we can use it on the command line. But that's why there's no document, there's no window, because it's running in a different environment. I'm just going to show a couple examples here with events and JavaScript objects and stuff. But so an event system is a common or classic architecture pattern or programming pattern. The basic idea is you have different parts of a system. What is a system? The browser is a system. Full stack a web application is a system. Anything with multiple parts. The object-oriented code that we're writing, we could sort of think about that as a system with the different classes, but everything kind of really shares the same space and works in a similar way. It doesn't quite make sense to talk about it as a system. But you can, in fact, because, and I guess because the browser thinks of the document object model as a system. But basically, the different parts of a system need to be able to talk. They send each other messages, and these messages are called events. And at the heart of it, that's all it is. Function send event name value. So this looks pretty silly, right? It's just a function. It takes two arguments. It creates a JavaScript object and it returns it. It starts to get a little more interesting. Like we could imagine, let's stick that in a variable. And I'm going to have to do a little cleanup here. So bear with me a sec. And I'm doing all caps because that's just a JavaScript convention. The main thing about an event is the kind of the event, the name of the event sort of matters, because that's how you tell the different parts of your system, of your program, which events to pay attention to. And let's try that one more time. And send event. So here's where it gets interesting. It's the name of the event. Right, and we're just accessing JavaScript object properties here. But I know this is a bit of review, and also switching from JavaScript to Python is a bit of a switch. So this is a good chance to just quickly review that as well. So now I got my code working a bit better. And there's nothing crazy about it. I have a function. It takes two arguments. We don't even do any logic or checking. You know, if I wanted to, I could do something like this. If name does not equal hello event, or I event log dad event name, return null. Actually, let's maybe return false. We do have to put these up here now. So like, if I, so there's, but for the example, I don't even need to do this. And this is a pretty, this is like the world's simplest event system. But sort of imagine this is one class, this is another class. And the basic idea is an event is just an object with a bit of information. And let me check in to see if how people feel about this example code and if there are any kind of questions around this, and then let's talk specifically about the DOM and events and event listeners. And there's nothing wild here. Thomas, yes, sir.
I was just curious, you said the all caps was a JavaScript convention, a convention for
what?
Yeah, is it, so what's the convention for? Is it for?
Yeah, great question. I didn't explain that. If I have a value that's hard coded, that's a constant value, that's a real value constant, that should never ever change. Like whether or not we were using const here, even if I used let, like the intent is that this represents this string, and that's like a name, a unique name that I always want to be able to like use in different places in my program and should never change. And all caps we use to indicate that, like a constant. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I didn't explain that. Yeah, so we have event types, right? Think const DOM content loaded from the other day. We have a little object that gets returned. The JavaScript object is more complex because it was like there was like this, and it had another nested object on one property. You know, and it was the same thing again. So in the document object model, the event objects are more complex and more layered, but they're still, and they even have functions on them. But at the end of the day, there's still JavaScript objects. We create an event, the event has a name, the event has a value. And here we listen for the event. And all these listeners are kind of like hard coded. But if I wanted to let's see, event name, callback function. Let's do it like this. If, and then actually, I'm not going to be able to make that work because it gets a little tricky because we have to pass in the event. But it's along these lines. Like it gets a little funny because we're actually like nesting functions within functions. It's going to look something like this. If event dot name equals event name, like this is a little complicated for JavaScript, to be honest. I feel like we've seen a bit of this and we've seen a bit with lambdas, but we've got a function, we pass it an event name and a callback function, and it creates a whole nother function. And for that one, we say, hey, so like, here's my hello listener. And something is wrong because I have a huge amount of
I think you need one more close curly bracket.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I was gonna start like just folks, actually, this is good to see too. This was gonna be my next debugging step, just doing it one bit at a time. So let's comment that stuff out. Let's see if this works. Oh, and if name, yeah, I don't know. I got something wrong there, but that's not critical to what we want to do, so I'm going to get rid of that. Callback function is not a function. Probably because, oh yeah, I didn't pass in the callback function of what to do. So it would look something like this. And we're not doing anything fancy here, but let's do it like this. So I've created, and folks, if you're kind of looking at this JavaScript and you're like, man, this is a lot, that's okay. The context switching from Python to JavaScript is real. I have an arrow function. And in fact, I'll just rewrite this as a JavaScript function to make it, I think, even a bit more friendly and readable. E is the name of the argument we pass into this function, which is shorthand for event. We're assuming the event has a value. We're not worried about the name. Now, when I create my event listener, I pass it this handling function. And let's see if this works. And I probably haven't saved my code. Or there is something else that I missed. Let's see. This is a great debugging example. But something bad is happening between here and here because I'm running into my error case. I mean, nothing bad is happening. Yeah, so I had something wrong in that statement. So a lot just happened here. To recap, we have a function, send events. We just pass it a string that's a name. We pass it a string that's a value. It returns a JavaScript object with those two properties. I create an event here. The kind of event is a hello event. I created a function here called add event listener. What it does is I tell it the name of the event I want to listen for, what I want to do when the event happens, the callback, and it creates a new function and it says, hey, if the event is the kind that we care about, call this function. I wrote this function that says, hey, when you get an event, say hello. I created a listener that says, hey, if the event is a hello event, call this function. And then I went ahead and did that. So let me pause and check in because I'm going all over the place and I want to see what questions people have, if this is a lot, if this is a little, how people are feeling about stuff. To kind of take it back to, you know, our JavaScript and stuff, let's look at this input element. document, add event listener. Let's find DOM, what is it, key press event? So it's deprecated.
You could use a button click event though, right?
You totally could use a button click event. Yeah. I want to use a key down event just to demonstrate like just how comprehensive the event system is with the DOM. So it looks like it's key down. Let's see if this works. You totally could use button click.
I was listening to something earlier and they said that you should always work toward using native JavaScript commands. Are all of these things native?
It's a great question. The document is not native JavaScript. The document is a very big, comprehensive JavaScript class that gives us an interface to the browser, to the DOM, to the document object model. So like, and that's why if I try to run this on the command line, we're going to get a bunch of errors because document doesn't exist. That said, for whenever you're writing JavaScript that's going to run in the browser, that's for the front end, you will always have the window object, the window class, the document class. So for our purposes, we can treat these as native. They're trusted and reliable and mature, and they're always there. Yeah, that's a great
It's
question.
difficult. It's difficult to understand if the browser is so dependent on JavaScript, how the DOM is not native.
To JavaScript, you mean?
I guess so, yes.
Yeah. No, so that's a really good question.
So, here's another question. Is there two ways to skin the cat? Can you show the DOM method and the JS method?
There is no DOM method that we have access to. If we were like editing the source code of a browser, which is probably in C++, there would be probably a document class and a whole bunch of C++ code that we could interact with. The way that the browser is designed, they don't want to give that to programmers for a bunch of reasons. So they basically said, here's JavaScript. You can run JavaScript in the browser, and we will give JavaScript ways to interact with the browser through this class that we give you. And then that touches the browser and does stuff. And then the browser does all sorts of other things. Part of the reason is history. When the web was first created and the first browsers were created, JavaScript didn't exist. I don't know how many years that was, but at least 5 or 6. And then it was added on. And there's a lot of, it's not worth getting into. There are historical reasons, there are security reasons. But that's a really good question, Jim, because it does feel like the document and the window object almost are part of the JavaScript language.
So then if we retrieve a page, or if we ask for a page from a server and it comes to us as an HTML page, excuse me, our browser retrieves a page from a website, and now this browser is interpreting the web page. The DOM, what's the word I'm looking for? The DOM functionality describes how, is it true that the DOM functionality describes how HTML will be processed in this browser?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a second.
So where I'm going with that, because as far as I know, browsers can only read HTML. It seems they can read like PDFs and pictures.
Yeah, no, browsers do more. They do more than read HTML because they interpret JavaScript. They can display an image. You can open a PDF file in a browser. And you're correct that like the document, I think the key word here is like model. And again, I'm going to use a CSV file as an example. like a CSV file, you have an Excel file, you export it to CSV, right? You look at the file, it's a bunch of commas and whatever, but we know that it really represents this idea of like a table, right? And so there's this idea of a document, which I guess we really could call an HTML document, but a document that has, and it's a tree, and there are nodes in the tree. And there are all these interesting properties that the nodes can have. And the HTML is that data. And then the browser reads that and it builds its own model of that. It's like two views of the same thing. And I apologize because that is a really good question. I do want to switch gears because I've been kind of diving into event stuff a lot, and I should make sure that we talk about how it works with the DOM and how to do some form interaction and stuff like that. So I apologize for that. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, just in the interests of making sure that we're covering the top items. I think the next place to go is, and there was a great question, are we going to be writing all of our event code from scratch? The answer is no. With all of this example code, just what I really wanted to drive home is at the end of the day, an event is just a JavaScript object. And when we do this document add event listener command that listens for this key press event and calls a function, I want to say it's like e log key pressed plus, let's try e dot value. That what we do here with the DOM doesn't look dramatically different from this sort of toy event example over here. Right? If I did const key down, then it would look really similar. And I think that will work. And it's probably not e value, it might be e dot target dot value. Yeah. So I think the other thing that's interesting with the DOM, and this page is a really good one. We have to talk a little bit about what we've seen is that basically every time you do anything, even press a key, even move the mouse, it fires off a bunch of events. And we can create listeners for those events. However, and let me find the right example to talk about this. The way that, I'll very quickly talk about event bubbling, and then we'll see it in, and then we'll kind of use it a bit, I think, with a form. And then we'll break and switch gears. And I'm going to go ahead and move this input element and put it inside a div, just for the sake of argument. And actually, yeah, no, we'll leave that there. And what we'll do is we'll do it like this. Div, one more div, and then a button. And we'll call this the magic button. So we've seen with the button, we can add a listener for an on-click event. We can add an on-click listener anywhere we want. And I need to fix some errors, and I think there's probably some very good feedback in the chat.
How do you ever click on a div? It strikes me you can only click on a button.
Right. So you can click on anything you want. And in fact, let's see if this works. Because again, let's see here. Where's that other paragraph? Yeah, let's try this one. Let's see if this works. Console.log. Click paragraph. And we go here. Yeah. So this goes back to like, if I'm the browser, how do I keep track of what's going on? Because I need to click into this input box to do stuff. As a user, I need to click on one of these items. If there's a link, I have to click on that. If there's a drop down, I have to click on that. So every DOM node, every element has all of these things that happen, and the browser is tracking all of it. So every time you click on anything, it fires a click event, and we can add listeners to it.
So in that example, or the nested example you had a few minutes ago, you had a div inside of a div,
Yeah.
inside of a div with a button inside of that.
Yeah.
Could you then show those divs, the inner div being 10% of the width, the third level div being 20%, and all the way up, so that you can show that if you do indeed click on the most inner div, you get something different than clicking on the most outer div?
Yes, I could. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction, but it's going to take us to the same place. And this is what I wanted to show, which is I click on the button, but it fires off both of these click events. And Jim, yes, sir.
Nothing for me.
Oh, okay, cool. And yeah, because this is the core concept that we haven't talked a bit about yet, that I think some folks are familiar with, but other folks are not, and is going to be good for us to talk about regardless, which is called bubbling. But you are right, I should do something to I'm trying to I apologize. We're going to rely on DevTools for the visual aid here. So when an event happens, the next question, so we know that we need to have an event fire for every single thing that happens in the document, because that's how the browser creates the user interface. That's how the different parts of the system talk and do stuff. And let me make that click and see. The next question is, how do we know who needs to care about an event? And the answer is that a lot of the times the browser doesn't know, and that's the programmer's job. And so when an event is created, it bubbles up through the tree. I click on this button, a click event is created. There is an on-click listener on this button. So that event, so the on-click listener function is fired. The event bubbles up to the next one because maybe this div needs to do something with it too, and so on and so on and so forth. Yeah, and exactly, we're going to stop propagation. So every time an event is created, it's created in whatever node in the DOM, whatever element the user clicked on, and it bubbles up through the tree, and it will fire off every event listener for that event we have. And then sometimes we don't want it to keep going. And so let's do this. Handle click A. And for B, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to grab the event. So the event object has its own method called stop propagation that stops the bubbling. And let's make this work. Handle click A. Okay, I hope that's right. I might have gotten my format a bit wrong here. I see Zach has a video game related question about like paying attention to what area the button clicks in. You could totally do that. Bear in mind that when you click with the mouse, that is also an event, and the event will contain the XY coordinates of the pixel that was clicked on. So that's another way to do it as well. Yeah, there's the event system is quite powerful. And in the lesson from the other day that covers DOM stuff, there is an example of watching mouse movements. I wanted to throw that one in there, but this is a bit more important. So let's see if this works. Yeah. So to recap, one event listener, two event listeners. I have something wrong in my code. That would be part of the problem as well. Let's see if this looks right now, because I wanted everything to be nested. Let's see if it still works. Yeah. One event listener, two event listeners, three event listeners. We saw before the event, it keeps bubbling up, right? On click event fires for the button. We have a listener on the button element. The event bubbles up to the next parent node. There's an on click listener for a click event on that one, and that fires too. But in that one, we have this, we call on the event this method stop propagation, and that tells the DOM enough, we're done. And where I want to go with this is with forms. And so I think I'm going to very quickly add in some form code and an example for that, and we can talk a bit about it. There are some other methods that we can interact with on the DOM as well. But I'll show this form one. I'll get the code up there. We'll take a break, and then Zainab, I think I've been eating up way more time today than we planned, but hopefully it's good.
Yeah, as long as they're
Yeah, I think we're doing good. So I just copied a bunch of code. Let's look at it visually and see what it looks like. And in fact, let's add like, I'm going to be very lazy and add a couple break tags and an H1, just so we have a little visual clarity. So this is the form that I added down here. It's got two fields. I click on it. Something should happen. Nothing happens because I haven't created this on submit event yet. And even more interestingly, if I get rid of this entirely, if I put stuff in the form and hit submit, the whole page refreshes. And not only does the page refresh, let's see if we can see this. Let's try it. Let's see if we can. Yeah, it's hard to see. See if I can. I'm not sure if it'll. I need to find the way that I want to display this in DevTools, but I don't know it off the top of my head, so I'm going to stop there. If anyone, but the real question is, can someone explain when I click the submit button on this form, why does this page refresh?
Isn't that just how forms work in HTML?
It is, exactly. Why do they work that way?
Is it so they can send whatever you're passing into, say, a backend to store that information?
Exactly. And that's what I wanted to kind of show here in the network tab. We might be able to. I do have preserve log.
And then it's just implied you want the current page to come back, or you have a choice to choose a different page.
Great question. That actually gets into what Zainab will be talking about. What happens when, and let me walk through what happens, and that'll, I think, answer those questions. I put information in a form. We have this form element, and we hit submit. Forms are a great example of how browsers have a lot of built-in behavior and also a lot of history. When the web was first created, forms were like the big thing. And you put in information on a form and you submit a button and it gets sent to the server, right? You create a new user account or you log in or whatever. So there's a lot of behavior there with the DOM, with JavaScript, with what the browser is doing that is just baked in because of the historical importance of forms. And so when I hit submit, the thinking was, well, this form has data. We need to send it to the server to create this user account. So when I hit submit, the browser should make an HTTP request to the server and send the data that's in the form. And of course, the DOM uses events to do all of this. The thinking was, because this was the classic way of doing things and still is, when the server gets that HTTP request with the form, it'll send a response back. It'll send a new HTML page to the browser. A great example actually is logging in. When I go to a website and I type my username, I wish I could think of maybe like Ticketmaster is a good example. Yeah, perfect. So I don't know if I have a Ticketmaster account or not, but if I did, I would put this information in. We can actually watch this in the network tab. And again, Zainab is going to go more into this. But the key thing is here, back in the day, the only way to do this was a form, and this was like a huge part of what the web was for. You put your information in the form, you hit the sign in button. The browser makes a request to the server. Let me make it a bit, which is, again, it's hard to see. But, right, we send that form information to the server, to this specific location at the server. The server sends back a response. In this case, the response is an error message. But if it was successful, the server would send back a whole new HTML page, or what's called a redirect request that says, hey, browser, you logged in, go here. So the default behavior with like a form submission was the thinking, to answer your question, Jim, the server is going to tell the browser what to do next. And that's why there's this default behavior of a page refresh. As soon as JavaScript was invented, people realized we can actually do stuff that's a lot more interesting, and there are other things that we may want to do. So there is an on submit the DOM event, and we can create a listener for it. And these days, because we can actually do pretty sophisticated stuff in the browser, and because of what we'll see with what Zainab is going to go over, we don't want the browser to like refresh the page. We don't want that default behavior to happen. So the issue here is not stop propagation, but prevent the default behavior of the browser. And now that automatic resubmit behavior does not happen. Form button clicked. And we can, in fact, and this is where I'm going to do a little bit of copying from, I'm just going to borrow, again, this is coming from the lesson from the other day on DOM event stuff. And I'll just kind of walk through here. So stop default behavior of HTTP request to server, which forces page refresh, get form data from event. And I don't know why we named this EVT. And so this little event object going all the way back to this example here has a lot of stuff. And with the form, it has all the properties on the form. So if I didn't miss something that needs to be changed in copying over this code, when we put this stuff in the form, that's all the key press stuff, and hit submit, we're doing good. It is from the code I copied. This is a great example of why you want to be careful with properties. This input field, you can give it a name, and that matters for grabbing form data, because our code here, field name from form properties. And then we can see here, name, favorite color. So that data is being set here and here. And by the way, placeholder, those little names in gray that kind of guide the user, those are here and here. That's why it is great to find good code to use for CSS and HTML, but just take the time to read through it a bit to understand those pieces, because otherwise the crufty stuff accrues very quickly. So it was a long journey to get here, I know, but this is kind of where we wanted to go. So this is a great time to check in and ask questions, and then we'll break and switch it up. So I'm really curious what's on people's minds.
So I had a question. The argument or the parameter for that handle form submit or whatever you name that function.
Mm-hmm.
The event it's just something that's happening in the background all the time, right? Like, or where is that pulling the event from? I guess that's what I'm confused on.
Great question. That's a really good question. Yeah, and there's two parts, like are events happening all the time, and where is this specific event coming from? So let me start with the second question first. And let's remember to go back to the basic idea of like what an event is, not just with the document object model, but there's all sorts of interesting backend stuff that uses events. The big thing about an event is an event has a name, it has a category, right? Hello, goodbye, DOM content loaded, because tons of events are being created all the time, but certain parts of our program only care about certain events. Here, we only care about an event whose name is form submit. And in fact, DOM event on submit. So I guess the actual name of the event is the submit event. And this only fires when a form is submitted. So this is special form behavior too. It gets a little more specific, but the short version is if you have a form element and a button inside it, when you click on it, it will, I'm not sure what that submit is doing there. It will create or fire a submit event initiated from this element, from the button. Either it's the button or the form itself. I'm not sure which.
So,
Yes, Jim.
so if earlier you said that all these events are always firing, but if you never say on hover, do this, is just because you're hovering on something, I would argue there's no event created.
Right. That's a great question. And so there's two pieces there: creating an event or firing it, and listening for it. We can write JavaScript that will create events. A lot of events, though, the browser will always make them. Like, let me copy the mouse moving one. That's, I think, actually a really good example for this. Let me find, there we go. So again, I'm copying this from the other day. I'm going to put this on the whole document. Jim, to go back to your question. So like, we could use this to only pay attention to like a certain part of our document. And this is, I don't think I'm going to mess with all this other stuff. This is a great example of copying and messing with things. Let's see if that works. So, and actually, this a great question. Are events always happening? I mean, if I'm just looking at a web page and not touching anything or doing anything, then no, there probably is no event that's being fired. Though, for example, the first time you load a web page, it does fire the DOM content loaded event. But so how does the browser know where the mouse is? Right? The mouse isn't part of the browser. The mouse is part of my operating system. But the browser has to pay attention to it so that when I click here, it can do stuff. So that when I click on a button, it can do stuff. So events are for different parts of the system to know what's going on. The way that the browser tracks where the mouse is the operating system gives the browser some information on that. But then the browser, the DOM, just fires a mouse move event every time the mouse moves. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that happens, but then that way that information is there for everyone who needs it. And I think I got a little off track with the other questions, but just to talk about events, like right now when I move the mouse over this button, I don't know if you folks can see, but the button gets shaded a little bit. That's a default browser behavior. Rather, it's a default CSS style. We could probably override that, but that's an on hover event. The browser doesn't know when we need to care about hovering over something or not. So it just creates events for everything that happens. And then whether it's listeners that we create or listeners that the browser always creates for the document and the document object model, the listeners take care of like doing the work of, do we care about this event? Should we do something? Does that help a bit? I know I went a little left field from the questions that people had. And Jim, and I apologize, I didn't see the other person in the Zoom grid who was asking about that. I want to check in to see if that's a little helpful, or if not, let's talk about it a bit more too. Because sometimes you just gotta talk about it 2 or 3 ways before it starts to click.
So it was I guess I'm still a little bit confused because I guess like in order to pass that event into the handle form submit function, you have to set up a listener for it, right? Like on click is an event, right? Or on submit.
Yes, there's probably when you.
So that's just like a keyword.
Yeah, it's a lot of exactly. It's all just keywords. Like there is a click event and that click, the name of the event is a keyword, submit is a keyword. And to go back to the JavaScript code, again, this is a really simple example, but this is exactly what they're doing. In the browser source code, somewhere, there is a giant file that is just full of all the different names of all the different possible events. And they're constants so that you can import and use the names without getting typos everywhere else in the code base. It might not be organized exactly that way, but I've worked on lots of code bases where that is exactly what it is. You have like, there will be a file named event names, and it will have every single DOM event name there is. Does that help a little bit? Because you're on the right path.
It helps a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but
Yeah. Yeah. And this too, like I think seeing this for the first time, like actually walking through this is a good example. So I move the mouse, the browser fires off mouse move events. Move the mouse here, there's a hover event that fires, but nothing JavaScript or HTML is listening, and none of the default browser listeners that it creates are listening. I click, there is a default browser behavior. Like the browser has, when this page loaded, created some event listeners on the DOM for if you click in an input field. And if you do, the listener says, oh, let me open up a little sort of autocomplete thing of stuff the user typed here before. And as I move the mouse and hover over each one, there is another event listener for each of these little HTML elements. As I can't get them to stay, where that is almost definitely how this is implemented. And if it's not, it could be. It does take a little while to wrap your head around. And I think too, like continuing to do it will help again. We should take a break, especially just honestly, I've been talking a lot, and I know that like we reach a point of diminishing returns with Zoom. So let's take a break and come back at 11. And at that point, I will probably hand it off to Zainab. We can chat a bit more if we need, but I think that to kind of circle back to what do I do with all this information, the short answer is this will make more sense the more programs you write using this stuff. So like right now, the best way you can use your time to better understand the DOM and events is to be doing programming exercises where you're creating forms and doing things that happen with click events and on-click listeners and things like that. That's going to be by far the easiest way to start to have this stuff make more sense. And then you kind of go back and forth, right? Because as you do it, then you'll kind of go back and look at some docs or ask us some questions. And I hope it'll start to click. No pun intended, but start to click. Let's take a break and come back at 11. Thank you, folks.